to share this with you in our offices, despite the fact that this event will be conducted in a hybrid fashion, as is known today, both face-to-face and via Zoom. We're very happy to welcome you all to this 34th regional seminar on fiscal policy. Now we will begin with the inauguration ceremony. And I would like, for that purpose, I would like to offer the floor to Mr. Mario Cimoli, Acting Executive Secretary of ECLAC, who will deliver some welcoming words. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have you all here. Dear Claudia Sangüesa Riveros, Undersecretary for Finances, Mr. Llamosas, Minister of the Finance of Paraguay. May you all be very welcome. We would also like to welcome the Spanish cooperation that historically has played a very important role and has worked with us in order to discuss this issue. The other organizations that are participating in this, well, we also greet them and we express our gratitude for being with us today. This fiscal seminar is takes place during an important moment within a very difficult context. One was thinking of the fiscal seminars held 2 or 3 years ago with a macro situation that was completely different, an inflation rate that everyone wanted to increase and not lower, with a monetary type of policy that was practically negative in all the more developed economies, and with a monetary policy that was also low for our own economies, with a small growth, but with a macroeconomic situation that was quite stable. Holding the seminar now within this context completely changes the situation. It is completely different, and the fiscal policy begins to play a fundamental and determinant role. I would like to talk about a few issues that have to do with the macro situation, how to frame this debate at a global level, with the change in macroeconomic policies and with the announcement of the European Central Bank that came out last year. It's really clear that the two major economies will move in parallel, perhaps at a different pace, with an increase in the monetary aspects. And you know this very well. And the issue of what will happen within the context of this nature, with the two biggest economies moving with their banks. And within this context, it will probably mean that all our economies will probably modify, whether we like it or not, their monetary situation as well. Some have already done that, others will follow suit. I would like to mention 2 points. I believe that, first of all, and this has to do with the debate of inflation before the crisis and the war in Ukraine, and at the very end of the pandemic, many economists and many schools of economics have made mistakes to a large extent, defining this inflation as something specific that was temporary, that was not lasting, that it would come and go, and there wasn't really a lot of concern about this. The debate today, however, changes. Most economies at a world level, and likewise banks and monetary authorities, are assuming that this inflation has a structural component. And if it has a structural component in the two major economies, such as the European and the US economy, and the intervention of banks in this sense, evidently the issue becomes much less temporary, much more structural, and we have to face up to it in a different fashion. And why is that important? Well, because I believe that there was an analysis that was either weak or a perception in much of the work that was done last year, in the sense that this would come and go and that we would not need to intervene, and that the monetary policy would have to remain unchanged, and the fiscal policy played an important part in that debate. Inflation has a context today which is it clearly implies a structural component. The price of certain goods beyond the breakdown of global chains is present. The analysis conducted by practically all central banks of the most advanced economies is that there is a structural component of base prices which is very high, and this will impact practically all the more advanced economies. We do have to explain why this inflation. Well, as you know, it depends on each on different situations. One could explain this as a result of the policies and plans that were used during the pandemic and that have increased demand and prices. Perhaps the issue of the breakdown of value chains is another reason. Perhaps the restriction of supply as a result of the war is another one. Perhaps the restriction of supply as a result of more sovereign policies at a global level is another reason. The fact is, however, that to have a clear identification of the causes for this, well, I believe that there is no econometric model of any central bank that can define this. It's a definition. It's a real cocktail. Nobody is too clear on this. If one comes from a much more monetarist perspective, one would say that this has to do with demand. A more structuralist would say, well, this has to do with structure, with costs, so with chains, and therefore the selection of monetary policies may be different. Everyone agrees that the fiscal policy will play, however, a very important role. And the major economies with fiscal policy are also thinking of strong restrictions. This happens in the US and in Europe. And when we face hurricanes of this nature, this impacts us, whether we like it or not. Now, the third conclusion of this analysis is that what is happening and how this can impact our economies is not so much the result of the history of the past, when normally financial crises or other types of shocks were practically endogenous to our own economies. This is a shock that reaches us as a shock, either because of the pandemic, because of the war, because of the 2008-2009 crisis. That's also an important consideration. It's a shock rather than an endogenous situation of our economies, and that is where debate is. And we hope that this panel will be able to discuss this with full clarity, because it is important. This panel begins to debate the types of policies, because evidently there will be a group saying, well, this inflation, that will say, well, this inflation has to do with supply, the breakdown of chains, the restriction of the supply, and so on. And therefore, a monetary policy that increases rates with a repercussion on demands and investment is not going to be too helpful. And we have to use other instruments. The question that I ask you is, are there other instruments, and to what extent fiscal policy can cover that? And perhaps a composition of the types of policies will mean that we have to use more orthodox tools and elements. That is a debate, because the major economies are doing that. We have to take that into consideration, and therefore we discuss policies. And I was recently reading a debate about the European monetary policy, in terms of which policy to apply, and whether to take on a traditional policy, including exchange rates and so on, or whether this has involves a high cost and the breakdown of change. This type of debate is not only held here, but also in the US and in Europe. The difference is that we have an intervention mass which is far greater. And therefore, if one mentions here the degree of freedom with regards to fiscal policy, obviously fiscal policy plays an important role, and how our economies react to a context of this nature through fiscal policy. What we well know is that the way in which we suggest a policy of this type has a structural condition within our region. We don't have a specific weight of being an important stakeholder in terms of monetary policies like all the others. The second point is that the issue of taxation, the taxation structure, has a tremendous heterogeneity in our region. It changes from countries that have a very high or very low taxation pressure, and therefore it's difficult to have one single policy for the others, for everyone. And the third aspect is it correct to intervene with an exchange policy and with a taxation pressure policy when the economy is experiencing a downward trend? And I quote Mario Draghi, just for the sake of argument, during his last intervention on economic policy in Europe, and he said, well, what is happening in Europe today is a pandemic. But obviously they're beginning with a fiscal policy of between 40-45%, and that means that they are experiencing completely different levels. And therefore the question one asks oneself, does the context enable us to have a policy of this nature, or policies of this nature will imply that we will have a much lower level of growth? We have to review taxation revenues because the context has changed, and that will be different. Then we have to view that we have to look at tax illusion and evasion, which is obviously a component. One must ask oneself: Is it? Can I do this in practice? Or when I do this, will this temporary crisis be over? And if so, I will have little scope for action. There's other types of financial instruments that will also be important. Instruments that may be for financing purposes because they have a high fiscal component, such as green sovereign bonds or blue bonds or whatever. By the time of the crisis is here, the situation that we are facing calls upon us to intervene. And the fiscal policy, in this sense, must have the capability to react because a fiscal policy reacts at a different speed than monetary policy. Summing up, we have a new situation, a different situation. And I don't know whether we are debating this with the depth that it requires at a regional level. The scenario is completely different to the one that we had in the past. And we couldn't imagine 3 or 4 years ago that we would be facing a situation of this nature. And what lies ahead for the future after these few weeks, considering the different situation of the larger economies and because of the data about inflation that comes from the US or from Europe, will change. And therefore, how do we react, and what is the role played by fiscal policy? And therefore, I believe that this is a very important seminar at a very important moment, which refers to a situation, and I would like to close with this, as was well shown by the policy brief that we have prepared in ECLAC with regards to the impact of the war, which is, we view it as an accumulated impact, will have an impact upon poverty. It will also impact food security. It will also have an impact on access to certain goods and specificities of the welfare state in informal sectors especially, and therefore the fiscal policy is tremendously important. You have probably read the document that we prepared, and we're thinking of an inclusive development, which is the theme of the document. But the provocation that we have given the present situation, is tremendously important, and not considering it implies not taking into account what is happening at present. So I hope that ECLAC will be able to host this very open debate that will enable us to analyze the new context, and so that we may be able to react and contribute among all of us in terms of how fiscal policies will act and behave in a context of this nature. Without further ado, thank you very much for being here, and we hope that this will be a very rich, direct, sincere and provocative debate. And so hopefully everybody will be able to debate this here at ECLAC. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Acting Executive Secretary. Now, some welcoming words by the Undersecretary of Finance of the Ministry of Finance of Chile, Claudia Sangüesa Riveros.
Can you hear me all right? Thank you very much for the invitation. It is for us a pleasure to be here, and especially at such a very special moment, to put it in a certain way. We are going through a series of crises, both in Latin America, the rest of the world, and especially Chile, just coming out of the pandemic. And now we are going through a difficult year in terms of inflation. And also in Chile, in a period of great social conflict. And so getting together to reflect on how fiscal policy, that ultimately what lies behind the social contract of our societies, may then help us to address this moment and look forward. We also have the climate crisis, which may well be behind many of the indicators that we are seeing today, and that is another challenge in the future that we must all face. And then later on, I will elaborate on where we stand right now in Chile. However, may I say that we're trying to build what we are calling a new fiscal compact, considering that we must address certain structural issues affecting our country, and that we must do so in a fiscally responsible manner. In our country, there is a fairly cross-cutting consensus regarding a fiscal policy that is financed with permanent resources, a permanent fiscal expenditure financed with permanent revenues. And so, therefore, we did have some savings that we spent during the pandemic because at the time when we could save, we did save. And so when we needed to spend, we spent. However, now there are new challenges lie ahead. And so we need more resources to finance these permanent demands. The pandemic itself showed, in the case of Chile and probably also Latin America, it showed our voids. We do have important challenges in terms of social policy with regard to health, for example, access, and also in terms of inequality that is quite structural in our countries. I will share some data. And so therefore, having now a way out of this crisis that is fiscally responsible, this is also part of what we are planning to do. And so I thank you very much for being here and also for this space. And I hope that we may have a day that may be fruitful to also learn from others and be able to draw some lessons. Thank you. Well, thank you, the Secretary. And so now I would move on to the first working session of the seminar, which is the panel of authorities of ministries of finance regarding the fiscal policy challenges for sustainable and inclusive